Hi, welcome to BetterWorldians Radio. BetterWorldians Radio is a weekly broadcast whose mission is to uplift and inspire you to make the world a better place. I'm Ray Hansel, joined today by my co-host, Gregory Hansel. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the very best in everyone. We believe the complex problems of our divisive world cannot be solved through negativity, blame, or impulsiveness. Solutions present themselves when we adopt fresh ideas, optimistic attitudes, and innovative responses. The BetterWorldians approach is to educate, inspire, and motivate people with positive thinking, positive values, and positive action. Joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio is Dr. Kenneth Gergen, a founding member and president of the Taos Institute and the Mustin Professor of Psychology at Swarthmore College. Dr. Gergen is a major figure in the development of social constructionist theory and its applications to practices of social change. He also lectures widely on contemporary issues in cultural life, including the self, technology, postmodernism, the civil society, and political conflict. Dr. Gergen has published over 300 articles in journals, magazines, and books.
Ken, hi, this is Greg. Thanks for joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio.
My pleasure.
Ken, as you know, and I'm sure all the listeners at home know, there's a divisiveness in our culture today that's hard to look past. Some say that it's as bad now as it's been since the Civil War. People screaming at each other across political and other kinds of divides. And what we're doing at BetterWorldians Radio, starting now in December and through 2018, is looking to find ways where we can look past our differences, find ways not to betray our values and our points of view, but by holding them, still find ways to talk to each other across this difficulty, because obviously just screaming back and forth at each other isn't going to convince anyone and is not going to solve this divisiveness, heal this wound that we're experiencing right now. So I'd like to chat today then about strategies and tactics for how people can understand and work with each other across these differences. But first I want to talk briefly about social constructionism, which is a sort of, I guess, theoretical framework that your approach is based in. So for those that don't know, what is social constructionism?
Yeah, first of all, Greg, I want to just share your feelings about our current condition and the challenges we face in the future. I think they're enormous and they're tremendously important. They're life and death issues, yes. And they're very much at the heart of what I'm concerned with constructionism. So I don't look at this set of ideas as simply an abstract philosophic orientation, but I think for a lot of us, particularly at the Taos Institute and a lot of others, we look at them as having a lot of potential in just these kinds of perilous times. So with that preamble, let me just say a little bit about social construction.
Sure.
There's an enormous amount I could say. In fact, I give whole courses for a semester on this, but let me give you the very, very brief introduction. Generally, we have looked at language as a kind of reflection or a picture of what there is, which is to say we've understood ourselves as sort of looking at the world and trying to describe it in the most accurate and truthful and objective way we can. So that a good language should be true, objective, and so on in characterizing what is the case. In other words, language operates like a picture, and if it's a good picture, it will tell us about the real world. Okay, so that's truth with a capital T. If language is operating properly, we have the truth about what exists. And that science, of course, tries to get us there, but so do a lot of other groups trying to understand what is really going on so that we can move with the truth at our disposal. Now, that's the tradition, and it's been there for centuries. Social construction is really interesting because what it does is start at the other end of the spectrum and say, look, whatever exists doesn't tell us about it. It doesn't give us a language. You can't look at things and simply come up with words. Rather, our language for understanding is developed within communities of practice or within relationships. Mm-hmm. So that as we form relationships and begin to grapple with things, we develop languages which reflect our interests and our values, our aims, and we come to understand the world in these terms. In effect, with the language, we create the world in terms of the views and visions and assumptions we bring to it. Mm-hmm. So where one says the language reflects the world with a big T, the other ones, constructionists, want to say, no, we create the world in our relationship. So let me just give you a quick example to make this very clear. So that, for example, my doctor will have a whole language at his disposal for talking about me, an enormous language, and have ways of assessing and so on what's true for him and his practice and his tradition. That might be very different. Let's say if I went to a psychiatrist, have a totally different language for understanding who I am, which might have to do with repression, for example, not with, let's say, hormones. Right. If I went to my hairdresser or a person who cuts my hair, there'll be a different language with a different set of concerns and a different set of values. And if I go to my family, they'll have a whole different language, and it won't concern hormones, and it won't concern depression or repression, and it won't concern the style of my hair. It'll concern daddy and so on. Right. Which is just, and the languages will be totally different. They can be, and they'll have truth within them. You can tell exactly about the state of my hormones from the medical and exactly the state of my style of hair and so on but they're truth always within traditions. What you might say are truths with a little t. So we understand that whatever we're saying, whatever we say about the world, whatever we count as truth, and whatever rationality we bring and whatever values we have are coming out of a set of relationships. So in relationships, we create or construct the world around us, how we interpret it, how we call it, how we act towards it, how we value it or devalue it, and what we think about it.
Interesting. So this is sort of a heuristic or pragmatic way of looking at the world. You know, I'm reminded of the old story of the blind men and the elephant, where the three blind men are trying to figure out what this thing is in front of them, and one of them is determined that it's very trunk-like, and one is determined that it's broad, wide body-like, and another is saying that it's tail, each coming to this from a different perspective, but all containing an element of the truth. But obviously in this case it's not individuals, it's our whole communities and our traditions and our histories and our cultures that are coming to bear, it seems.
Well, it's a little bit different. You're on the right track, but from a constructionist perspective, there isn't a whole elephant and with different visions, so that there isn't an ultimately true there. The very fact that we call it an elephant is already coming from some perspective.
Right.
So it isn't as if we could converge and simply have the truth of the whole elephant. In some of those languages, there is no elephant.
Right. Interesting.
I mean, for example, a physicist, I'm not a solid object. There's just no object there. Mm-hmm. There are no hormones. There's no repression. There's no style. It's just a totally different universe that you create with a language of physics.
Right. No, great point. So tell us, can these worlds of meaning then shared by these different communities change over time?
Well, sure, they can change over time in the sense that we've come into these traditions as we've developed. As our relationships as we've engaged in various relationships, all the way from growing up in a family to local schooling to friends and so on. So, yeah, these are in a constant constant process of change, although that change may be very slow, so that one can become embedded in certain ways of understanding because they hang out in the same groups over and over and over again.
Well, what's happening these days? What happens when our worlds of meaning, these different language communities, our traditions conflict?
Yeah, well, let me say a little bit more about what I'm seeing here as some of the advantages when there's conflict. I mean, look what happens when you take on this kind of perspective. Immediately you realize that you are not bound by any declaration of the truth, any value that you've learned. That is, you're kind of liberated. There are no ultimate constraints on the way we can understand. So there's no base which you have to touch in order to go on. So there's a very strong liberating quality here. And secondly, it allows you to have a kind of curiosity, because you don't have to defend a given perspective against all competitors. You can say, hey, that may be a different way of looking at it. That's not my religion, but how do you look at it? How do you understand it? Because maybe I can gain from that. Maybe there's some values that I don't have that I should have, or maybe that's a different way of looking at the person. I could be curious. And thirdly, it invites a certain kind of humility about wherever you stand, because you've got no grounds for it other than the people with whom you're related. So you can't put a stake in the ground and say this is true or this is real or this is right beyond anyone else's perspective about it. So wherever I stand, I cannot simply say everybody must accept this or else. You have to be there's certain humility about it. And finally, that it invites a lot of creativity, because it says whatever and this is going to get very, very important in terms of conflict, all of these, it's going to say wherever we are, we can create new things. With the next conversation, we could conceivably create another way of looking at it. We could conceivably bring points of view together and create something that was never there before. So those are some of the pluses here in terms of trying to orient ourselves towards conflict.
I think it's interesting. I think they're very big pluses, particularly curiosity, humility, and creativity. It's kind of a way of looking at things, saying, we have to recognize that no one of us and no one group of us absolutely has access to the way things definitely are, has access to certainty, and we have to recognize in our humility that that's the case, and reach out to each other and see different ways of looking at things, see what we may learn, different ways of describing the world. And in doing that, obviously, that sparks curiosity, as you say. How do different people see things? What does that teach me about my own way of looking at things, and what can I help them share and share with them and show them different ways of looking? And then finally, the kind of mashup that happens from that kind of humble exchange is very creative, because it creates new ways of looking at things and so forth.
Lovely. You're a great conversation partner.
Thank you.
Let me also say, I've written a book in recent years called Relational Being, and the position I take there is, look, all we've got to stand on is our relationships. So what we have got to do somehow, we've got to protect that process of relating above all else, because that's what gives us a way of life, a way of thinking, a way of investing ourselves in the world. It gives us meaning and hope and direction. So relationships have got to be saved above all else. And when relationships go awry, when we go into conflict, come back to that issue, those relationships are likely to disintegrate and fall apart. And above all, we have got to save those, cherish them, nurture them.
No, I love that. That's a focus on togetherness. When we talk about only having our relationships, we really mean all we have is each other. Here on this this blue spaceship Earth, right, traveling through through space and time. One question I think everyone asks when they think about a viewpoint like this, and I think everyone can speak, well of humility, curiosity, and creativity, is the challenge that so many of these kind of worlds, so many of these traditions or stories. We actually spoke last week along similar lines with someone who does work on the kind of neuroscience of story. Is what happens when these stories, when these worldviews see themselves as fundamentally certain, and that looking beyond themselves seems like a self-betrayal, seems like something that is to break, to find themselves floating kind of in an infinite nothing, without an access to certainty. How do we not try to take something away from people, but at the same time allow them? Because I think, from large-scale religious points of view to even individual points of view, when something just fundamentally feels right, it's difficult to get people to a place where they say, okay, I'm willing to recognize that there's a different way of looking at things and that we all are coming at this in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this is, of course, the major challenge for the future, isn't it?
Mm.
For one, and there's a lot to be said here, and we could talk for a long time. For one, fundamentalism, that is, first of all, it's difficult, yes, to go beyond what one thinks is really right. And for those of us who've been in these political conflicts of the last year, it is very difficult to see the other side. It's very difficult to understand how people could be that way. Mm-hmm. But part of that is because we tend to be in groups that support exactly that kind of feeling. Mm. That is, that we go about from day to day and isolated from each other, as often said, in bubbles. Secondly, we've got a rhetoric, which is a traditional rhetoric of the right, the true, which is in place, and it's that rhetoric is so common, and we have very little in the way of a way of talking about, well, this is true and its opposite is also true. I mean, that's very difficult for us. It's just, you might say, Asian or Oriental. It's not something we accept in the West. Mm. So you've got also technologies which can keep you 24/7 into that bubble. Yeah. So there you are, only talking to a certain number of people, and who reinforce is right, is true, and who see that as righteous and is worth dying for in certain cases. So yeah, how do you break that? Now, one thing is that from a constructionist perspective, you say that, look, you have that rhetoric, you have that set of beliefs, that way of talking which works within that group, but that's not all you have. That is what I call a multi-being. That is, you have available, you have the arguments on the other side. If you were asked to role-play those arguments, for example, you could probably do that. Mm. We understand the opposition. We've heard the arguments. We could make them. So they're in there. And we have a lot of other perspectives available to us. We're not just unified, only having one perspective. Mm-hmm. So if placed in the conditions under which we didn't have to defend a perspective, in which there were multiplicities, or in which we could realize the ways in which we're indeed united, you've got an opening. I work with a lot of people who do conflict reduction work. Mm-hmm. One of the sort of orientations of this to a dialogue is, let's not talk about our conflicts. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the way we live every day, our issues with schools and weather and sports and food and so on and so on, mm-hmm. realizing all the ways in which we probably agree. Yes, it's been a hard winter. Or yes, the taxes in this part of the country are really too high. Or isn't it great what the patriots are doing, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that there are whole sets of agreements that you can find if you don't start with that thing about which we disagree. And secondly, I mean, there are a whole set of these kinds of ways that constructionists will think about, of not going directly to the conflict, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. that is, those things about which we disagree, but going, let's say, to the values that might underlie them. Yes. And probably those values will begin to look similar. That is, if you take, let's say, the pro-life, pro-choice, people on both sides of that argument are want the well-being of society, want the well-being of women. That's not the disagreement. But once you realize that the values are the same, then the conflict becomes really one of how you reach those goals. Right, right. I mean, we all want peace, for example. Mm-hmm. But the very grounds on which we seek peace will divide us. But if we could somehow agree that what we really want is tranquility here, mm-hmm. what we really don't like are savaging each other, yeah. How can we go about doing that? And now you've got a new conversation. Yes. How can we go about doing that?
It's interesting. I'm hearing these themes emerge from you. I mean, the one that I'm hearing again and again is humility, understanding or being truthful wherein we know we don't fully understand something, that we know there's more to things than we could possibly express, even within our traditions. There's as an honesty of our depths and understanding that even in as individuals or as in communities, we have a lot of different perspectives. It's not just one thing. And then there's humanity, by which I mean this notion of common humanity, where we see each other in our everyday lives and try to find the kind of values that we may share, even though we approach them very differently. And so it's funny how this is something, there is something kind of behind it to a certain extent, but what's behind the construction are things like humility, things like honesty about our depths and complexity, and a notion that there's a common humanity that we're all approaching in a very different way.
Nicely said, very nicely said. I'm also thinking here of one of the other I spend a lot of time, by the way, trying to think about and collect and celebrate various practices for conflict reduction from within a constructionist perspective. How do we do that? And one of them that we found and really works well, if you can relax people about their position, if they're not defending them, and you ask them to reflect on them, they can find sort of problems or gray areas within their own perspective. At base, if you relax, you realize, well, there's this and that, and there's, it's not quite clear what the Bible says about this, or the law on that is really kind of ambiguous when you get to this, or there are exceptions, but generally, if you're into a debate about the right and the true, they'll never come up. You'll never realize them. But relaxed, they're there. And that sort of openness to humility is there if you can access, or you can put people into the conditions under which they can access it.
No, I think that's great. I heard a saying recently, strong beliefs loosely held. The idea that we should hold true to our values and our traditions, but at the same time hold them lightly enough, hold them softly enough that we can be honest, look into them, relax, as you say, about the positions, and see where, through being honest with ourselves and being humble regarding how we may not completely understand everything about everything, see that there are some gray areas, as you say.
Yeah, well, the other thing that's really quite interesting here is if you look at some of the major schisms of today, let's say either religious or political, you realize that we so often see the polarities, that is, the people at the extreme that we look at as sort of fundamentalists, but you can find within those same religions, with those same political positions, people who are less extreme, you might say, who in fact find within that tradition things which are very acceptable for the others. That is, if you look at any Democrat will like to make sure that we have an economy which functions, you might say, conservatively, which saves itself. But when that problem is when we go into these extremes, then conservatism is bad, and sort of giveaways are bad. So it's to say that within any perspective, there are tremendous variations on what counts as that perspective, whether it be Christianity or Islam or Democrats or Republicans. It doesn't lead you inevitably to an extreme view. There are tremendous domains of overlap and sympathy and understanding of each other.
We'll talk more with Dr. Kenneth Gergen in a moment, but right now I'd like to take a brief break and tell our listeners a bit about our sponsor, a social enterprise called A Better World. Better World is an uplifting virtual world game on Facebook that encourages social good, positive mindsets, and giving back to social causes to make a real positive difference in the world. Players actually do things like sharing their acts of random kindness in the real world, expressing gratitude for things they're experiencing in the real world, sending get-well notes to real-world sick children, and so much more. To date, over 4 million people have participated in this virtual world game, and they have performed over 40 million good deeds in over 100 countries around the world. Each month, A Better World partners with a different charity and challenges game players to do a certain level or number of good deeds within the game. When they do, A Better World releases funds directly to that monthly charity. This fall, A Better World is working with St. John's Hospice to provide shelter and supplies for homeless men in Philadelphia. You can find out more at abetterworld.com. And now let's welcome back Dr. Kenneth Gergen and my co-host, Gregory Hansel.
So, Ken, we were talking about the extremes, and it brings me back to a question I'd like to explore a little bit more with you, which is this idea of honoring our faith commitments, our political commitments, our personal commitments, and at the same time trying to reach out. Now, you were talking about the necessity of humility, honesty, finding our common humanity. You talked about beginning with discussions of the everyday. How else can we try to overcome these divides and find ways to honor ourselves and our communities while still looking toward the others?
Yeah. This is, of course, a major question, and there are several planes in which you have to think about that. For me, we're talking about practices, how to do that. And you talked about random acts of kindness, and that's, of course, you might say a day-to-day practice, which may function in very positive ways, and I shall hope about that. But the question then becomes, well, what are the areas of practice in which we can help these things to happen? And everyday life is one thing, and we talk a lot in my circles about the forms of conversation that we have. How do you just approach each other? What do you approach each other with a mutual inquiry? How do you ask questions of each other? Let me give you just a small example because I want to move on to talk about institutions here.
Sure.
This constructionist view is controversial in the academic world because there are people who've spent their whole life trying to establish what is true and what is real, and I'm arguing that these are constructions within the tradition, and that they don't want to accept that at face value. But if we argue about that, we'll go away and probably not want to talk with each other. If, however, I enter that conversation with an inquiry, with a curiosity about what are you interested in these days? What are you doing these days? What's your work about? Tell me about that. And they get very excited about that, and chances are very high the next thing they'll ask me is, what about you? What kinds of things are you interested in? What are you doing? At that point, they're open. They can begin to take it in because I have opened the door and accepted them, so they see that what I'm doing is not an attempt to obliterate. It's some attempt to say, look, we can all live together in this world and realize that none of us are on some kind of royal road, and there are problems with everything we do from some other standpoint. Okay, so those are like everyday ways of relating to each other.
And let me just stop you for one moment. I do want to get to institutions because I think that's so important. But what I'm hearing you say there is listening. I think there's a kind of a common saying where some people aren't really listening. They're just waiting for a break in the conversation so they can talk. And I think that you're sort of saying, don't bring your values, your tradition like that. Don't just wait for a break where you can kind of insert your way of thinking into things, but instead just listen. Right? Be curious and listen to what other people have to say and see how they see the world, because maybe you'll realize that it's not as radically different or as problematic. And even if it does seem that way to you, you can at least get a sense of the real person underneath.
Yeah. Well, the other advantage of that is that listening, being curious, is a form of honoring and accepting the other. It is as a conversational move, it is to say, I value what you're saying. I'm curious about you. I'm honoring that. So already you've created the basis for some kind of positive relationship. But there's more in listening than just simply understanding. It's also a way of cementing a relationship. By the way, 1 second, just because what I just said is fairly extreme, but getting away from personal blame, that is, of blaming people when things go wrong, because we always when things go wrong, there's a strong tendency in our culture to find out the source, who caused it,
right,
and to find out where the buck stops and to punish that person. But if you realize that whatever we're talking about is wrong is always being created within a whole set of relationships, you stop short of blame. You try to begin to understand the whole relational context out of which something comes.
Right.
And it's not easy, but it's absolutely essential to stop that particular form of going on. All right, so back to institutions
yes.
now. Well, the question I have here, and let's say we take education or you take large organizations, is how to emphasize and bring to the fore and place a value on the relational process. Mm-hmm. How to move away from isolating individuals and trying to make strong the relational process out of which harmony can be created. So, for example, you take education. Education is, we've set it up in such a way that everybody gets graded along some continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody is in a kind of competition.
Yes.
It's like a competition of all against all for getting ahead. I'm going to be above you, and isolating yourself. So, in effect, you've created a situation where we won't share with each other because you may get ahead of me. I don't want to tell you what I'm doing because you may get a better grade than I do. And I've got to worry about my grades all the time. I've got to worry about how well I'm doing, what school I get into, and so on. So you've got a whole condition through the grading system of isolating people and tearing apart relationships. So the question is, how could we undertake the process of evaluation in such a way that you don't have that kind of isolating outcome? So I'm embarked on a whole set of studies and trying to gather discussions together from around the world about how we can undertake evaluation in such a way that it's a sharing. How can we have dialogues about what's good and how we're progressing and how are we doing together?
Mm-hmm.
And how could we have something called relational evaluation, so that instead of you judging me, you, let's say, the teacher, and me, the student, we get together and talk about it. How are we doing together, and how is this working out, and where are we progressing, and where is this not going well, and what can we do better? Or I'm engaging a whole class in that. What are we learning? Is this going well for us? Or some of us losing out? How can we help each other? So you have a set of dialogues, not with the intent of getting everybody graded, but with the intent of increasing the learning process and the relationships which go along with it. Let me talk about organizations for a moment in the same way.
Sure.
As we have traditionally, in most certainly corporate organizations, periodic reviews, so that you get judged by your peers or by the person who you're working for about how well you've done. And these can be very anxiety-provoking. One can lose their job based on this, and they're isolating because it means everybody's in the organization for themselves.
Right.
I have to ultimately look out for myself, and relationships are secondary, and I only will have them if they're useful in my getting ahead. And I will guard information. If this information makes me look bad, I'm not going to share it. I'll hide it. I'll suppress it. So how could you have other kinds of institutional practices which would bring to light relationships and which would reinforce them? So I work with a company, for example, in Finland, and they're trying to develop practices of evaluation which are based on group dialogue, which would say people who work together would have a dialogue on how we're doing. How is this going for us? Who's participating? Who's giving? Who? Let us talk about each person and what we value about what they're bringing to this organization, and talk about how we're doing well and where we're doing well, and how could we do better? Where are we falling apart? So that the evaluation is not towards you did well, you did poorly, you're doing subpar, but how are we doing? Because we all depend on each other. We need each other. We can do it better, much better, if we're mutually supportive than if we're moving each in our independent orbit.
I think there are some immense paradigm shifts there, and I agree with that. I want to unpack some of that, if you don't mind. I'm thinking about in terms of blame and competition and moving more toward cooperation and solving problems. And I think it's funny that, there's a tendency to think that if we don't blame someone that's done something wrong, and if we don't have a zero sum, I got to motivate myself through competition or otherwise nothing's going to get done. There's a tendency there to thinking that not looking that way is kind of a laziness or letting things go or not holding people to account. But I think the opposite's actually the truth, where you're actually requiring more of individuals. I think that's both true in institutionally in terms of communities and our politics, but also in terms of our companies. There was an interesting study a few years back with how Microsoft ran into some trouble. And I've heard this from MBAs, and I've heard this from folks that worked at Microsoft, actually. And they very much put together the very competing silo model where every business unit was competing against the other, and people were bonused based on how they did better versus other business units. And the funny thing is Microsoft made a lot of money during that time, but they missed basically every single technological leap that occurred. And when people talked about what it was that did it, it was this way that, groups couldn't work together across aspects of the software platform. Office couldn't work with Windows, Windows couldn't work with Xbox and games, and that's a very specific example, but the idea is there was so much competition between units that there was no cooperation, and the company couldn't work together to handle the seismic shifts that were happening in the technology world, and the new guy that they brought in immediately ended that practice, and the company is now doing dynamic things and really innovating for the first time in decades. And, so it's interesting to see that when we look at each other in ways that say, hey, let's figure this out together, it's not saying, oh, let's let the people that don't bring things to the table get away with murder. It's no, actually give them the responsibility to have to cooperate, to have to all, on a level, work together to get something done.
Yeah, that's a lovely example, and let me expand on that just a bit, because for organizations of any kind are facing tremendous challenges in the world today, partly because of the technologies which circulate ideas at a very rapid rate. So we live in a world in which the half-life of any idea is very short, and people all over the world are innovating in ways that are going to challenge whatever it is you're doing. And the field of technology is only one of them that's happening in virtually every aspect of life. There's this global flow of information, ideas, values, technologies, and so on, which means that to stay afloat means continuous change. It means continuously challenging what you're doing, reflecting on it, innovating, adapting, and so on. Now the question is, what kind of organization can best move in that sort of rapidly changing world? And you come back here to how it is we in this organization collaborate together, how it is we get along, how we share, understand, sympathize, are willing to open ourselves to other ideas, are willing to collaborate and generate transformations within the organization. So this paradigm shift you're talking about, in some ways, is essential in terms of organizational life. It means, look, if we collaborate or die.
Yeah.
We become fossilized so rapidly without that collaborative shift. And this whole individualist paradigm, particularly that's so strong in the West, just is not functional for the future.
I think that's an interesting point, collaborate or die. I mean, just to bring the Microsoft example back, because of their brand, because of, frankly, the war chest that they had, they were able to not change and still do well for a while. So it seemed and I'm trying to draw a parallel here to other areas of life, that everything was going fine. But in reality, because they weren't changing, because they weren't responding to the times, because they weren't being limber and being willing to see the world differently, eventually they did decline. And then when it did, look how much actually happened. Right? Look how much it actually changed and how much catching up they had to do. And so to what extent are we seeing that same kind of thing in our political battles today, where perhaps both sides are fossilized and are refusing to change? And to what extent do we need to change and need to see the changes in our world and respond to them adequately so that we can kind of move on?
A good point. And one throws up their hands the fact that in terms of political life, that there isn't this sense that, look, we've got to work together,
right,
and that somehow working together almost gets a bad name because it's not being true to the party, and that with parties become more important than the common good, then what is governance about?
Right.
There's a number of us in this sort of constructionist area that are trying to look towards or develop and find examples of what we call collaborative governance, where we look at governance as not only collaborating within itself, but collaborating with the people it's supposed to serve. So, for example, you don't make laws from the top and simply insert them into public life. You work with people in public life to generate laws and policies that are going to work for a period of time. And that conversation should be continuous. Mm-hmm. For example, I work with this group in Denmark, which does work on welfare. And their laws are much like ours, and that is, says, look, we have these laws and principles about what you can get if you're homeless or jobless and so on. Here's what you'll get, and this is how we do it, and this is what you must do in order to get these funds, or you don't get them. So you just set laws and policies regardless of the particular needs and wants of the people you're supposed to be serving. Mm-hmm. So what they've done instead of that, where they've spent a lot of money and people are still on the streets, is to say, why don't we work together with the people who are poor, homeless, and jobless? Have discussions with them. What is it they particularly need? What will help them in their particular circumstance? And how can we do that, given what we have available? So it's much more sensitive to the common needs of what both the government and the people need in a collaborative practice, where you're not sort of saying either you do this or you're not doing right, or we'll in fact blame you for not doing it. So it's, again, a movement to try to say, how can you bring some of these collaborative orientations which honor the relationships and the need for coming together over one's being right and one's being principled and not the other.
I was just going to say, it's interesting that, you're touching on, I think, some values that are part of the American DNA: experimentation, innovation, cooperation, from the standpoint of the melting pot even. There's been a part of the success story of, let's say, the American century, if not the entirety of the country's history, is our ability to try new things and to come at things in new ways and to come across boundaries and cooperate and do that together. And I think the funny thing is, and you talk about the fossilizations, is we've kind of fossilized into these frozen moments of ways of looking at things on different sides of all issues, and we're refusing to acknowledge our need to change and our need to innovate and experiment and to work together.
Well, I think ultimately, I want to stay optimistic on this and say, look, the world conditions are going to generate a sensitivity and appreciation of collaboration and cooperation. It comes up for example, in the environmental case, so clearly that if we don't work together across nations, across civilizations, that we will all perish, because we will so destroy our environment that our ways of life will crumble. And we must do that together. So when the environmental sensitivity, which brings us together, sort of trying to unite the whole of the world, is the wave of the future. We've got to do that, with, for example, with energy and with water, and we've got to think about economies all in the same way.
No, I think that's right. Yes, please.
that's in the long run. In the short run, my word, we can hardly get through the next day without bickering and battling, can we?
Right. No, it's true, and I think that you're making a good point. At BetterWorldians, we're very much optimists, and we're very much full of hope. And I think one way of looking at this is that every disruption is an opportunity, once again, to come together, to cooperate, and to innovate, and to respond to change. We have the opportunity here to take some of the challenges that face us, and rather than just kind of stick our heels in the sand and insist on a particular way of looking at things, every single moment along this line of disruptions can be finally a moment we can say, okay, enough is enough. Let's try something new again.
Yeah. It's again part of the constructionist premise. We are not bound by these traditions. We're not bound by a particular way of looking at them. They are ways of looking at them, looking at the world, and they may have value, and we don't necessarily want to give them up, but we're not bound by them. And in the next conversation, we can create something else, which is, to me, a very optimistic view, even though it's hard some days to get through with that optimism intact.
Yes, indeed. Well, Ken, we've had a very wide-ranging discussion, and I appreciate everywhere we've gone. It's so fascinating. I wanted to see if I can bring us full circle right as we come to a close here, and first ask you, given the necessity of cooperating and looking beyond a kind of frozen, stuck, stubborn way of looking at our traditions, what are some tips across all these areas of life where we can start bridging these divides through dialogue? How can we start?
Well, you can start with the next conversation.
Yes.
You can start by listening. You can start by appreciating. You can start by questioning where you stand. You can start by being curious. That would be some of the tips, but they're right there. They're the next person you talk to after this conversation. How do you relate to them? And is that going to be trying to judge them and trying to find where they're wrong or how you're better? I mean, all those that's the old traditions which have gotten us into such a bad place.
No, I think that's exactly right, and it's having that humility and that honesty and that curiosity and that desire for creativity that you talked about.
Lovely.
Well, one last question, Ken. It's a question we ask every week of all our guests, and in this case, let me ask you to wax very optimistically and say, how do you think that overcoming our differences through dialogue, through being able to see, to hold these beliefs somewhat lightly, and to recognize and to be humble and honest that we don't fully have access completely to certainty, completely to truth, how can doing that, do you believe, make the world a better place?
Well, I think the way you've described that, it would be a much better place if it were like that. Now, I think it's important to realize that we're not saying we must overcome differences. It's like differences are okay. We, in fact, carry differences even within ourselves.
Yes.
It's how we live with the differences that really matters. And if we try to make those differences into conflict, into one must perish or the other must succeed, that's where we get into trouble. If we could benefit from the differences by different ways of looking at things, different approaches, they're like resources, and allow them to coexist and to transform in the coexistence, I think we could look forward to the lives on this planet, which would be wonderfully beneficial to all, including the planet itself.
Well, Dr. Gergen, that's exactly what we're doing here at BetterWorldians Radio, is to try to facilitate that kind of dialogue. As Greg had said throughout the show, these are the shows that we're doing right now. This is what we're focusing on through conversations with folks like yourself, and conversations recently we had about the importance of narrative and story, and we're going to continue this, and hopefully we can bring this to light in a bigger way. So thank you so much for joining us on BetterWorldians Radio.
Thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Well, you're very, very welcome. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3. whose nonprofit is to make the world a better place by encouraging the very best in everyone. Essentially, we believe it's important to plant flowers and not just pull weeds. So we focus on positive thinking, positive values, and positive actions. In short, our vision is to bring out the BetterWorldian in everybody so that we can all make it a better world. So go to BetterWorldians.org to become part of this important mission. And until next time, everybody, please be a better Worldian.